The purpose of this video is to bring to light some of the things that happened in the 20th century that many people may have not known about. Our story starts in the year 1878 in a small Georgian town in the Caucasus, then part of the Russian Empire. Born Joseph Juhiachlevich, he would change his name to Stalin, meaning man of steel, in 1912. He lived in a poor neighborhood in Georgia. His father, who was a drunk, often beat Stalin and his mother. He would leave the family when Stalin was very young and never came back. Stalin was primarily raised by his mother, who was deeply religious, and she wanted him to become a priest, and even enrolled him in the Typhus Theological Seminary, which was a school meant for young boys to gain education in religious studies. But during this time, it was very much clear they had no passion for religion in any sort. Instead, he started questioning religion teachings after reading Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and radical Russian authors. Often in secret, the seminary's strict authoritarian atmosphere and heavy discipline, inquisitorial punishment, and rigid orthodox dogma clashed with his growing curiosity about science, literature, and politics. Also during this time, the political opposition was growing in Russia. People saw how the French Revolution changed things in France, and some of the Russian people wanted the same for Russia. Also, with the release of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto in the 19th century, it started to get people talking about change in Russia. There had been many uprisings in the 19th century, including the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Despite strict censorship, some students circled banned books and political pamphlets. Stalin became involved with underground Marxist circles, developing anti-Tsarist and anti-clerical views. The seminary's efforts to suppress these ideas had the opposite effect. They radicalized him even further. All this was happening while Stalin was still attending the school, but in 1899 he was finally expelled. One of the reasons for this was the failure to take final exams, and another reason was political activity, being absent due to underground meetings and clashes with authority. In my opinion, he came to view the church, which often sided with the state, as part of the system that kept people, like his family, powerless. And he saw how the people at the top, like the Tsar, were living, while him and his family were barely making it by with the money they had. By the 1890s, the Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party was spreading Marxist ideas in cities like Typhus. Stalin joined local study circles, learning the Marxism promised: the overthrow of Tsar's regime, workers' right, and an end to class inequality. Marxism's promises of a scientific, inevitable revolution appealed to him. Furthermore than the church's focus on the afterlife, Stalin saw Marxism as both an intellectual framework and a practical weapon against the poverty, inequality, and authoritarianism he had known all his life, and it offered a direct, active role in changing society, unlike the passive hope of religion. Stalin wanted a way out of poverty, and he also saw the writing on the wall, meaning he knew that the current social order was waning and communism was on its way in. Eventually, the time came in the late 1890s and early 1900s when Stalin was already active in Marxist circles in Georgia, organizing strikes and spreading propaganda. In 1903, the Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party split into two factions: the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin. The origins of the Bolsheviks goes back to the 19th century. Marxist thought entered Russia in the 1880s and 1890s through the intellectual circles in St. Petersburg and abroad. Key early Russian Marxists included Georgy Peslavanovi, Vera Zukhlachi, and Pavel Alex Ordorod, who founded the Emancipation of Labor group in exile in 1883. These thinkers argued that capitalism was growing in Russia, creating an industrial working class that could lead a socialist revolution, but only after capitalism had run its course. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1898 was formally founded to unite Russian Marxists. Its aim was to overthrow Tsardom and eventually establish socialism. And we cannot talk about the Bolsheviks without talking about Lenin, who was the leader of the party. At this time, Lenin was already in an active revolutionary role, but was in exile and not found at the founding Congress. He was arrested in 1895 for his activities in the Union of Struggle for the Liberation of the Working Class in St. Petersburg. After release from Siberian exile in 1900, Lenin worked with Pahlavi, and others to launch the party's newspaper, named The Spark, which became the ideological hub of Russian Marxists. He was deeply involved in shaping strategy, especially the idea of disciplined, centralized party, tightly disciplined revolutionary party. The other party that rivaled the Bolsheviks were the Mensheviks, which split off from the Bolsheviks in 1903. During the Second Congress of the Russian Socialist Democratic Labor Party, the dispute between Julius Martov and Vladimir Lenin created two factions. The name Mensheviks was a bit misleading, because at times they had more members than the Bolsheviks. The split started over party membership rules. Lenin's position was that a party member must be actively involved in a local party committee and under strict discipline, while Martov's position was that a party member could simply accept the party program, support it financially, and help in any way, not necessarily be a full-time disciplined revolutionary. This reflected a deeper ideological difference. Lenin wanted a small, tightly organized vanguard, like a cult. Martov wanted a broad, mass-based party. Martov favored a broader, more democratic membership, and in 1905 the Mensheviks supported mass strikes and the creation of Soviet councils, but saw them as part of a long-term democratic struggle, not an immediate socialist revolution. This is because they believed that Russia first had to go through a bourgeoisie democratic revolution, like in 1789 France, before socialism could happen. This meant supporting a period of capitalist development, with the working class cooperating with liberal middle-class forces to overthrow the Tsar. During World War I, many Mensheviks adopted a defensive position, supporting Russia's war effort to defend against Germany, while Bolsheviks took a hard anti-war stance. After the February Revolution toppled the Tsar, Mensheviks joined the provisional government alongside liberals, believing in cooperation to achieve democracy first. Bolsheviks criticized this as a betrayal of the working class. After the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution in 1917, the Mensheviks opposed them, arguing that revolutionary was premature and undemocratic. They were gradually suppressed by the new Soviet regime and formally banned in the early 1920s when Stalin sided with the Bolsheviks because their secretive, disciplined style matched his own temperament, and he saw it as a quick way to seize power. In the years 1904 to 1905, Stalin began corresponding with Bolshevik leaders outside Georgia, sending reports and articles. In 1905, after the Russian Revolution broke out, Stalin traveled to the Bolshevik conference in Finland. This is likely the first time he met Stalin in person. Lenin reportedly noticed Stalin's commitment and ability to operate in dangerous underground conditions, and Lenin saw how this could be very useful in the political climate that they were in. Also during this year, 1905, was the Russo-Japanese War. This war was another reminder of how low the Russians became militarily. Tsar Nicholas II thought this would be an easy win to boost morale and political strength, but it backfired when the Russian Navy sailed across the globe to fight the Japanese, only to lose the majority of their fleet in the engagement. This made revolutionary thinkers and Marxists even more determined and more brave about their approach against the Tsar, knowing that his power was waning. Going back to Stalin, in the years 1905 to 1912, Stalin became a professional revolutionary, writing for Bolshevik's newspaper and organizing Georgian party cells. He gained a reputation as a capable enforcer and fundraiser, sometimes even through robberies, and propagandist. He appealed to Lenin's revolutionary tactics on ground, but was largely operating independently due to geographical and secrecy. By late 1905 to 1906, Stalin was firmly aligned with the Bolsheviks, favoring Lenin's vision of a tightly disciplined party. He wrote short revolutionary articles and manifestos for local party papers. The beginning of his political writing career. Even though Stalin believed in communism, it did not stop him from being a thief. The Caucasus was a hotbed of revolutionary smuggling and exportation, meaning armed robberies to fund the movement. Stalin was involved in planning these, most famously in 1907, when he robbed a bank in Georgia, which netted the Bolsheviks around 300,000 rubles. These actions were controversial even within the Bolsheviks, but Lenin often turned a blind eye if the money helped the cause. Stalin would later be arrested in his first major arrest by the Tsar's secret police. Sentenced to 2 years in exile in Siberia, he used his time to read Marxist theory and keep in limited touch with Lenin through party contacts. He would escape exile early and return to underground activity in Baku and the Caucasus. He helped publish illegal Bolshevik newspaper and organized strikes in 1909. He would be rearrested later that year, briefly imprisoned, then released again, where he returned to his old ways. In 1910, he traveled to Baku again to maintain Bolshevik influence among oil workers. This kept communication line open with Lenin's circle in exile. Arrested once more and sent to Siberia, he would escape after a few months. Lenin saw Stalin as a useful person in this region. The central leadership struggled to control. In 1911, he went to return to St. Petersburg under a false name to help rebuild Bolshevik networks. And he acts as a local link between the underground and Lenin's leadership. In 1912, Lenin creates a new Bolshevik Central Committee in January and appoints Stalin. A sign of trust, despite Stalin's limited face-to-face time with him. He pushes, quote-unquote, Marxists in the national question, arguing for a socialist approach to national autonomy, boosts his reputation as a Bolshevik theorist, and he would be arrested again in February and exiled in Siberia for 4 years. By the end of the year, Stalin is still in exile, but now recognized as the top Bolshevik leader within Russia in 1913. Stalin is in Siberian exile in one of the most remote and harsh places in the empire. He spends most of his time writing and corresponding with Bolshevik leaders. This exile is much more stricter, and escape is nearly impossible, so Stalin is effectively out of the game for several years. Then in 1914, World War I would begin. Many Bolshevik leaders are scattered. Lenin remains abroad, and Stalin is stuck in exile. The Russian state tightens repression of radicals, making revolutionary work even more dangerous. Stalin's main activity is writing, reading, and maintaining minimum political contact. The February Revolution in 1917 topples the Tsar, and after this Stalin is freed from exile and returns to St. Petersburg. He becomes editor of the Pravda, the main Bolshevik newspaper, and initially takes a moderate line, even tolerating cooperation with the provisional government. At first, Lenin returns from exile in April and pushes for a radical stance. Quote, all power to the Soviets, unquote. Stalin aligns himself with Lenin's line. During the October Revolution, Stalin is part of the Bolshevik leadership that seizes power from the provisional government. And during this time, there was a civil war within Russia, where the Soviets had to centralize power. Stalin would be appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities, which basically meant Stalin's first major government role was overseeing the integration of non-Russian nationalities into the new Soviet state. He also helped with the relocation of industry and resources during the Russian Civil War. This supports Lenin's controversial decision to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in 1918 to end Russia's involvement in World War I. Stalin would also travel to key fronts as a political commissar and organizer. Stalin would gain a reputation for his harsh discipline and ruthlessness, including using executions to maintain order in the Red Army. This period shows the steel side of Stalin's political personality, which meant effective, pragmatic, and unforgiving. In 1922, he would be appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party. Initially seen as an administration job, he uses this role to quietly place loyal allies in key positions, laying the groundwork for future dominance. Because he could decide who went up and down within the party, this made anyone he did not like be prevented from promotion under his supervision. This would foreshadow his regime later. During this time, he also joins the Politburo, which is the party's highest decision-making body. The Politburo was a very important role because it set all major political, economic, and military policy for the USSR. Unlike formal governments like the People's Commissar, the Politburo wasn't accountable to the public. It only answered to the party leadership. So if you controlled the Politburo, you effectively controlled the Soviet state. And since it was the Politburo was only made up of a small number of people, it was easy for Stalin to control these people. In the early 1920s, the Politburo had a few dozen members, including Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kosmakovich, Barkarnow, and Stalin. This made personal relationships, alliance, and political maneuvering extremely powerful. Stalin used his general secretary role to influence who got into the Politburo and who got kicked out. While Lenin was still alive, the Politburo often debated fiercely, but Stalin learned to form short-term alliances with certain members to isolate others. For example, in the mid-1920s, he teamed up with Zinoviev and Kamenev to block Trotsky's influence, then turned on Zinoviev and Kamenev with Bukharin's support. Stalin's general secretary job controlled the party's machine, which were promotions, assignments, and Congress agendas. His Politburo seat gave him direct influence over policy decisions and kept him in the room where the top strategies were made. Together, these positions let him decide who held power and what the state's direction would be. When Stalin entered the Politburo in 1922, he was still not the obvious successor to Lenin, but the Politburo was one of the places where all the key figures interacted, meaning it was Stalin's perfect stage to play rivals off of each other, win allies, and eventually ensure that, by the late 1920s, no major decision could pass without his approval. He used this position to kill off political opposition. He uses his main admin powers to promote loyal allies into the Central Committee, the larger body that elected the Politburo, meaning he could influence who sat on the Politburo in the first place, and form a triumph to counter Trotsky's, who was seen as Lenin's likely successor. When Lenin falls ill, Stalin uses his Politburo presence to control access to him and shape what other members hear about Lenin's view. In January 1924, Lenin dies. His testament warning against Stalin is kept secret by Zinoviev and Kamenev, his allies at the time. In the Politburo debates, Stalin lets Zinoviev and Kamenev lead the attacks on Trotsky, portraying him as arrogant, too militaristic, and not a true Leninist. And Stalin even tells Trotsky the wrong date for Lenin's funeral on purpose to make him seem selfish. The Politburo decisions undermine Trotsky's role in the Red Army, stripping him of influence. And by 1925, Trotsky is removed from his post as People's Commissar for War. With Trotsky weakened, Stalin switches allies, now siding with Bukharin, Rakoviev, and Tomaskis in the Politburo. He uses the majority to outvote Zinoviev and Kamenev on policy, especially in industrialization, speed, and relations with peasants. Stalin uses propaganda to portray them as factionalist, a serious offense in a party obsessed with unity. In 1926, Zinoviev and Kamenev are expelled from the Politburo. Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev now have a common enemy, and they unite as a united opposition, calling for faster industrialization and even more internal democracy. At this time, there was definitely an internal struggle for power within the Soviet regime. Ironically, the whole point of the Central Committee was a way to represent the people who they said had been oppressed for many centuries, which were the poor workers and peasants. But in reality, they were all fighting for themselves and were rarely ever thinking about the people they swore to protect. Stalin uses the Politburo and the party to deny his political enemies any speaking time, block their resolutions, and control meeting agendas. In February 1927, the Politburo votes to expel all three from the party entirely. With the left opposition gone, Stalin turns on his former right-wing allies, Bukharin, Rakoviev, and Tomaski, over disagreements about ending the new economic policy and pushing rapid collectivization. Stalin uses the Politburo to control packed meetings with his supporters and push through his economic plan. Bukharin's group is labeled as right deviants, political toxic, in the Stalinized party. By 1929, they are removed from the Politburo, leaving Stalin as the sole unchallenged leader. But the worst was yet to come. After Stalin had cleared the Politburo of any serious rivals, the next stage was the consolidation of his dictatorship and radical transformation of the Soviet Union. In 1929, he launches the first 5-year plan to rapidly industrialize and force collectivization of agriculture. He uses the Politburo purely as a rubber stamp body. Distance becomes rare and dangerous. At the turn of the decade, Stalin becomes even more ruthless in his lust for power. By 1930, Stalin had decided to push for a full collectivization of agriculture, moving peasants from individual farms and collective farms or state farms. Officially, it was to modernize agriculture, eliminate backwardness, and increase grain output for industrialization. Unofficially, it was also about breaking the political power of the peasantry, especially the so-called kulaks, a deliberately vague label for wealthy peasants, or simply those who resisted his decisions. Resistance was widespread, and it took many different forms. There were violent uprisings which armed clashes would break out in regions like Ukraine, the North Caucasus, and parts of Siberia. There were also sabotage, which were peasants who slaughtered their own livestock rather than to hand them over to collectives. Between 1929 and 1933, the USSR's livestock population collapsed by more than half. Families also started to flee to cities or remote areas to avoid collectivization quotas. And some people did passive resistance, which meant withholding work, concealing grain, or just simply refusing to sign up for the kulaks, the collective farms. The state responded with brutal force. Stalin used a secret police called the OGPU, predecessor of the NKVD. It became the main enforcement arm of the collectivization. This included mass arrest, deportations of suspected kulaks and their families to Siberia, the Urals, or Central Asia. There were also the execution of ringleaders. This was anyone who organized local resistance. The central government also stole property. Confiscation of property included livestock, tools, and even homes were seized. The quota enforcement from the OGPU agents were brigades to ensure targets were met regardless of fame and risk. By early 1930, Stalin's government introduced the infamous policy of dekulakization, which divided kulaks into three categories: execution on the spot for the most hostile elements, deportation to labor camps for others, and internal exile to remote settlements for the rest. And even within the Soviet higher command, there were fears of purges. Even senior figures like Molotov and Kanavik understood that opposing Stalin publicly was political suicide. Unanimous decisions were engineered, not through consensus, but through the unspoken reality that disagreement would lead to accusations of sabotage or right deviance, sympathy for kulaks, which result in arrest or worse. One Politburo member later admitted that atmosphere was, quote, not one of the collective leadership, but of collective obedience, end quote. An even more grim detail about this time was the Holodomor, meaning death by hunger. It was one of the darkest consequences of Stalin's collectivization policy. The Holodomor took place mainly in 1932 to 1933 in Soviet Ukraine, although famine also struck other grain-producing regions, like the Volga Basin in Kazakhstan. This was the second stage of collectivization. By this point, collectivization had broken the traditional peasant economy, destroyed incentives to farms, and reduced food availability. Ukraine was a key grain-producing republic, and Stalin viewed it with political suspicion because of its strong sense of national identity. Its cultural revival in the 1920s and occasional calls for greater autonomy, the Soviet government demanded impossible high grain producement quotas from Ukraine in 1932 despite failing harvests. Local officials faced arrest or even worse if quotas weren't met, so they took everything, leaving peasants with absolutely nothing. Grain seizure brigades, often accompanied by the OGPU, raided villages searching homes for hidden food. They confiscated not only grain, but also vegetables, livestock, and even seed grain for the next year's harvest. They were basically being beaten into submission. Entire villages that failed to meet quotas were blacklisted, which meant trade was banned. Goods were withheld and areas were effectively blockaded. People could not leave to find more food or to escape to a place which had food. Keep in mind, all this was done deliberately by Stalin. The Soviet press did nothing about the famine. Speaking openly about it could lead to arrest for anti-Soviet allegations. International journalists were misled. Walter Dunbarry of the New York Times echoed official denials, while others like Gareth Jones tried to expose the truth. The following remarks are made by the eyewitness accounts, and they describe the horrors of what they saw. People started boiling grass, bark, or leather for food. And then came widespread anemia and illness from malnutrition, parents abandoning or even killing their children to spare them a slow death. There were even some cases of cannibalism documented in Soviet police reports, and entire villages disappearing. Most historians place the Ukrainian death toll between 3.5 and 5 million, including famine in other regions of the USSR. The total deaths may be 6 to 8 million. Mortality rates were highest in rural Ukraine, with some losing 25% or more of their population. Many Ukrainian historians and several governments today regard the Holodomor as genocide because it targeted Ukraine, a nation with a growing independence movement. The Soviet leadership deliberately blocked aid and restricted food distribution to famine areas. The Ukrainian cultural leaders, intellectuals, and clergy were simultaneously being arrested or executed in what became known as the Great Purge of the Ukrainian intelligentsia. From Stalin's perspective, the famine crushed Ukrainian resistance to collectivization, eliminated large parts of the peasant class, most likely were going to oppose Stalin's rule, cemented Moscow's control over Ukraine, and in the aftermath, survivors were often relocated or integrated into collective farms under even stricter state control. Ukrainians' cultural revival of the 1920s was reversed. Russification accelerated. The trauma of the famine left deep scars in Ukrainian society. It became a suppressed memory under Soviet rule, only openly discussed after independence in 1991. After the Holodomor ended in late 1933, Ukraine and the Soviet Union as a whole didn't return to normal. Instead, the famine marked a turning point where Stalin's control became nearly totalitarian, both over the countryside and the Communist Party. By the autumn's harvest of 1933, the famine began to ease, partly because the Soviet state finally reduced grain production quotas, and partly because the next crops came in. However, millions were already dead, and many survivors were too weakened to return to normal work. The countryside was depopulated in some regions. In parts of Ukraine, whole villages stood empty. By 1934, over 90% of the peasant households were in collective farms, which meant Stalin's policy goal had been achieved. Private farming was almost entirely eliminated, except for tiny household plots. The state could now control grain supply directly, feeding industrial cities and exporting surplus for hard currency. The famine had broken peasant resistance, but Stalin also wanted to ensure no political challenge could arise from within the Communist Party. Former oppositions like Bukharian, Rykov, and Tomsk were still alive, but politically powerless. Stalin was biding his time. They too would meet a grim end. On December 1st, 1934, Sergei Korolev, a popular Leningrad party boss and potential rival to Stalin, was assassinated. Stalin used this murder as a pretext for a massive wave of arrest and execution. This was the opening act of his Great Purge. This time in the mid-30s would be marked by the Great Purge, where Stalin would kill anyone who could even oppose him. Stalin unleashed the NKVD to root out quote-unquote enemies, ironically including many of the same people who had helped enforce collectivization. This just showed no one was actually safe. There were also show trials, which were staged in Moscow for former Bolshevik leaders, accusing them of absurd conspiracies with foreign powers. Hundreds of thousands were executed. Millions were sent to Stalin's own concentration camps, called the Gulag. Ukrainian culture was heavily repressed. The brief Ukrainianization policy of the 1920s was reversed. The Ukrainian intelligentsia, writers, academics, clergy, faced mass arrests and executions, sometimes called the executed resistance. The countryside remained tightly controlled, and memories of the famine were forbidden to discuss. By the late 1930s, Stalin's industrialization drive, fueled partly by grain exports during the famine, had transformed the USSR into a major military power. Coming from the Holodomor, the OGPU learned how to operate at a massive scale. They would identify enemies, creating fabricated categories like kulaks, and would carry out arrests and deportations effectively. Local party officials learned that obedience was survival. Those who failed to meet Moscow's orders could be accused of sabotage. From 1934 to 36, Stalin simply redirected this machinery from peasants to the party elite, which were military leadership, intelligentsia, and thousands of former kulak elements who had survived exile were once again arrested. Many officials from Ukraine's grain requisition campaigns who had seen the famines firsthand were accused of being part quote-unquote counter-revolutionary conspiracies. These served two purposes: to erase eyewitness of the famine and prevent any alternative political network from forming. There were also show trials of prominent Bolshevik leaders like Zinoviev and Kameyev, which portrayed them as spies and collaborators, much like kulaks had been painted as enemies of the state. Mass operations targeted specific groups, the Polish operation and German operation, and the arrest of entire ethnic communities. Military purges deconditioned the Red Army's top leadership. Millions were arrested, hundreds of thousands executed. The Great Purge was essentially collectivization politics turned inward. With the same logic and even some of the same personnel, in the late 1938 to 1939, Stalin started to wind down on the purge. The NKVD had executed so many people, including military officers, that the state's capacity to function was starting to suffer. Stalin quietly replaced NKVD chief Nikolai Yezhev with Lakiria Bevera, who slowed the pace of the arrest but kept the system intact. The military, gutted by purges, began emergency recruitment and training to rebuild officer rank. During this time, to the west, Germany had been changing the political landscape within Europe. Stalin saw this and took notice. In 1939, Soviet diplomats tried to negotiate alliances with the West, but talks failed due to deep mistrust. Stalin shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler. Secret protocols divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence, including Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania. This allowed Stalin to avoid war with Germany, for now, and give him time to strengthen the Red Army. I think both Stalin and Hitler knew this wasn't going to last very long. The USSR invaded Poland from the east on September 17, 1939. This partition gave the USSR western Ukraine, western Belarus. While it brought new territory, it also pushed the Soviet border closer to Nazi Germany, which made tensions between the two countries even worse. Then came Stalin's demand of Finnish territory for Leningrad security, but Finland refused, which led to the Winter War. The Red Army invaded in November 1939, but suffered heavy losses against stubborn Finnish resistance. Even though the Soviet Union had much more manpower and tanks, they suffered in the end, more than 300,000 dead, while the Finns only suffered around 70,000 dead. This could be contributed to the terrain, where Soviet tanks could not push in deep snow, and the Finns having the better lay of the land. The USSR eventually won in March 1940, but at the cost of international embarrassment. The purges had clearly weakened the military. In summer 1940, the USSR annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, as well as Bessarabia and northern Baku from Romania. Stalin's new empire now reached its largest pre-war borders, but tensions with Germany were rising fast. Then came Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the USSR to stop the spread of communism. Stalin was at first surprised and shocked, because he thought he had more time until he had to fight the Germans. In autumn 1941, the Germans blitzkrieg tore deep into Soviet territory, capturing huge swaths of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics within months. Millions of Red Army soldiers were encircled and captured. Entire Soviet armies disappeared within weeks. All this could be attributed to the fact that Stalin had purged all of his competent army officers during the Great Purge. And since then, the Red Army had no actual leader. Even though Stalin tried to lead the army, it was very clear that he had no knowledge of military operations, and it only ended in disaster. As Stalin started to recover in July, he ordered industry to be relocated east of the Urals to keep protection from German bombs. The war was framed not just as defending communism, but as a great patriotic war, appealing to Russian nationalism. Ironically, his ideology, communism, was against nationalism, but at this time, Stalin didn't care. He only wanted to stay in power. Leningrad was surrounded for 872 days. Over 1 million civilians died of starvation and bombardment. In late 1941, the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow. A Soviet counter-offensive in December pushed them back. This was the first major German defeat of the war, but Stalin could not have achieved it without help from the Allies. Starting from September to October 1941, the first British convoys delivered tanks, aircraft, and food to the Soviet Union. In November 7, 1941, the U.S. formally includes the USSR under land lease protection. In winter 1941-42, large-scale American shipment began, with supplies coming via Arctic convoys through the Persian corridor and later the Pacific route. All of this was vital for the USSR to stop the German advance. Without the land lease from the Allies, they would have lost the war. Even Stalin said, quote, "Without the use of American production, we could have not won the war," end quote. After 1945, Stalin's post-war rule was marked by the Cold War rivalry with the United States. It continued political repression and rebuilding the war-torn nation. However, the human cost was staggering. Over 27 million Soviet citizens had died, and much of the western USSR lay in ruins. The USSR rebuilt war-torn cities while tightening political control. Wartime relaxation of the repression ended, censorship returned, and dissonance was crushed. And the NKVD hunted traitors and collaborators in 1947. Stalin funded the Communist Information Bureau to coordinate communist parties worldwide. Then came the Berlin blockade. In 1948-49, Stalin tried to force the Western Allies out of West Berlin by cutting off road and rail access. The U.S. and Britain responded with the Berlin airlift flying in supplies for nearly a year until Stalin backed down. Then came the Doctor's Plot. Many Jewish were accused of conspiring to kill Soviet leaders, seen as preparation for another purge. Fear and suspicion permeated society at the time. Stalin's paranoia was at an all-time high. Now, since the Soviets controlled most of Eastern Europe, Stalin imposed harsh economic and political policies on satellite states. Resistance, like in East Germany and Poland, was suppressed by force. By early 1953, Stalin was increasingly isolated and mistrustful, even of his closest allies. And on March 1st, 1953, he suffered a stroke at his dacha. Guards and aides, fearfully of making a wrong move, delayed calling doctors. Stalin died 4 days later on March 5th, 1953. His death triggered a power struggle that eventually brought Nikita Khrushchev to leadership and the start of de-Stalinization. At the end of his life, he had nearly killed more than 9 million people, including his own son, when he was captured by the Germans. His own children did not seem often fond of him. His own daughter had left the USSR to live in America. There are very few figures in the world who had such an impact on history, and whose name will live in infamy throughout the years.